Welcome. Today we unpack one side of an uglier chapter in Christian history. Our focus is on Christian opponents of the slave trade, also known as abolitionists. But focusing on abolitionists is not intended to escape the hard facts. Because it crossed the Atlantic Ocean, the slave trade in question is usually called the Atlantic slave trade. But it could just as fairly be called the Christian slave trade. After all, Christian abolitionists only existed because the European enslavement of Africans was, at the same time, the Christian enslavement of Africans. However, the slave trade is rarely analyzed with reference to the reality of Christian division, and that is what we'll do today. We'll look at writings by both Catholics and Protestants, analyzing both their arguments for abolition and how Christian divisions actually fostered disagreement about ending slavery. It's not difficult to find intersections between the growth of Christian divisions and the growth of the Atlantic slave trade. In fact, the two began at almost the same time. Growing division meant that Christians lacked such things as a shared authority structure and shared theological criteria for determining the acceptability or the unacceptability of slavery. For the first 2 centuries after Columbus's first voyage, only one Christian church proactively sent out missionaries, and that is the Catholic Church. One of those missionaries was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Catholic monk who lived and worked in the first half of the 16th century. When he arrived in the New World, he was horrified by what he saw. He detailed the abuse of native peoples in his short but hugely influential work, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. In order to impress upon his Christian readers the extent of depravity that he witnessed in the New World, Las Casas inverted a long-standing assumption. Before the advent of Christianity, the Romans had believed themselves uniquely civilized. This idea passed into Christianity, which had taken root and grown in a Roman cultural context. Christian missionaries took with them both the Christian message and Roman cultural assumptions. So, in 16th century Spain, Christians maintained these assumptions. They assumed that they were uniquely civilized and moral, whereas the inhabitants of the New World were the opposite. But Las Casas denied this. In his short account, the uncivilized were not savages. Rather, the conquistadors who hailed from Christian Spain were the true savages. The native peoples were instead like martyrs, and they were innocent and meek and suffered unjustly. Las Casas advanced a theological argument against slavery. Since the early 15th century, the Catholic Church had opposed what is sometimes called dominion theology. Dominion theology asserts that only the righteous may wield political authority. So, from this point of view, if a political leader falls into sin, they no longer have the right to the throne. And, since non-Christians are not in a state of grace or right relationship with God, they entirely lack political authority. The Catholic Church recognized that this sort of theology would only create political chaos, as no one is ever without sin. Consequently, the Church condemned dominion theology in the early 15th century. But among Christian colonizers, both Catholic and Protestant, a variant of dominion theology rapidly developed. It held that only Christians have a right to land ownership, and that non-Christians could be enslaved by Christians. To counter this new form of dominion theology, Las Casas turned to natural law, an ancient philosophical idea that, in the 16th century, was quite popular among both Protestants and Catholics. Simply stated, natural law refers to the moral convictions generally shared across societies and cultures. There's no official set of natural laws. It was simply believed that all people are born with a basic sense of right and wrong. Las Casas used natural law to argue for the rights of native peoples. First, following Thomas Aquinas, he believed that the law of nature was known through reason, which all people have. Second, the right to life is part of the law of nature. We are, or at least we should be, guaranteed the right of self-preservation. He concluded that because enslavement undermined both the right to life and the right to self-preservation, slavery was wrong. Las Casas' advocacy led to one of the great what-ifs of Western history, and also one of the great what-ifs of Christian history. What if slavery had been banned early on? In fact, there was an attempt at doing so in the 16th century. In 1537, the Catholic Church became the first European institution to ban slavery, or more accurately, to try and ban slavery, as the Pope decreed, "By apostolic authority, through the present letter, we decree and declare that the said Indians and all other peoples who in the future will come to the knowledge of Christians, even if they are outside the Christian faith, are not deprived, nor are they to be deprived of their freedom and the mastery of their possessions. Rather, they are able freely and lawfully to use, possess, and enjoy freedom and ownership. Nor are they to be enslaved." Although the phrase natural law is not found here, the Pope heavily relied on the natural law arguments of Las Casas and others inspired by Thomas Aquinas. Political existence and the right to personal freedom were not products of divine revelation. Rather, these were simply natural. That is, they were part of created human existence and shared by all people. Therefore, Christians had no special right to anyone's land, just as they had no right at all to the ownership of slaves. But the Pope's ban failed. And here we return to the issue of Christian division. The Catholic Church was then entangled in debate with early Protestants. Protestants weren't going to listen to the Pope in the first place, and amidst the political upset of developing division, Catholic rulers looked to their own self-interest. So, slavery and all its horrors only continued to grow. Christian division affected the influence of Las Casas' work in a second way. His book was soon picked up by Protestants, who translated and sometimes illustrated the work. This particular illustration was done by Theodore de Bry, a Reformed Protestant. But de Bry only illustrated those portions of the work that portrayed Catholics in a negative light. Catholics thus appeared violent and untrustworthy. So, quite against Las Casas' goals, his book was transformed into an anti-Catholic polemic. And yet, Reformed Protestants do not treat native peoples any better than Catholic conquistadors. And so, we see that de Bry's illustrations did not exist to help native peoples, but only to attack other Christians. Christian division was not responsible for the Atlantic slave trade, but it did help perpetuate it. As the centuries passed, the slave trade grew. Las Casas was not the only person who protested against slavery, but when we today think of abolition, we're really thinking about those who lived centuries after Las Casas. The pursuit of abolition only took hold in the 18th century. Significant portions of two Christian groups, the Quakers and the Methodists, became strong opponents of slavery. From there on, other members of other denominations joined in. But no single denomination, so far as I know, was entirely opposed to the slave trade. Rather, slavery was an argument that took place within and between Christian churches. But by the late 18th century, abolitionist sentiment was more widespread. A good representation of that is here. This is one of the most famous images from the abolitionist movement. Am I not a man and a brother? It was made by the English potter Josiah Wedgwood in 1795, and it became the official medallion of the British Anti-Slavery Society. One of the most powerful arguments in favor of abolition was the testimony of slaves themselves. An especially popular work was the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself. Don't let its unassuming title fool you. Equiano's narrative was the first published first-hand account of slavery by a slave. Initially appearing in 1789, it was rapidly reprinted. By 1794, it had gone through 9 editions and was published on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Equiano begins his work by discussing his childhood and subsequent entry into slavery. And Equiano makes clear that slavery depended entirely upon kidnapping, which today we often call human trafficking. Initially, Equiano was kidnapped by another, unnamed African group. In time, he was traded, and then traded again, and eventually sold to white Christian Europeans. Throughout his narrative, he records beatings, further instances of kidnapping, repeated examples of having his own goods stolen, and the acute legal disadvantages that slaves experienced, because as slaves, their testimony was inadmissible in a court of law, thus giving victims no opportunity for ever getting back what was taken from them. In fact, Equiano tells us that even as a freed slave, life was so difficult and disadvantages were so great that some Africans preferred slavery. Slaves live in constant alarm for their liberty, which is but nominal, for they are universally insulted and plundered without the possibility of redress. And then he asks the reader, in this situation, is it surprising that slaves, when mildly treated, should prefer even the misery of slavery to such a mockery of freedom? Testimony of this sort opened the eyes of many to the horrors of the slave trade. One of the most well-known Christian abolitionists was John Newton, an Anglican minister. Today, he is best known for something else, the hymn Amazing Grace. But Newton wrote a famous abolitionist work entitled Thoughts upon the African Slave Trade. First published in 1788, it rapidly went through 3 editions. Newton was sweeping in his criticism. He wrote, "The slave trade was always unjustifiable." Perhaps surprisingly, Newton believed that the slave trade did not just harm the enslaved, but the enslavers as well. He explained, "I know of no method of getting money which has a more direct tendency to efface the moral sense, to rob the heart of every gentle and humane disposition, and to harden it, like steel, against all impressions of sensibility." In fact, Newton was, in some ways, like Las Casas. The true savages, he argued, were not the Africans, but the slave traders who came from the supposedly civilized world of Christian Europe. Newton described slave traders as white savages, but he described the Africans as supposed savages. Like Las Casas, Newton challenged his fellow Christians to take a realistic view of slavery, and thereby to take a realistic view of themselves as well. Equiano and Newton were both Anglicans, although each had a deep appreciation for other non-Anglican Protestants. Historically, Anglicans have been less likely to lay exclusive emphasis on the Bible. Anglican abolitionists sometimes invoke Scripture, but they also appealed to a range of other matters, such as human decency, and even practical concerns such as economic growth. But some Protestants have historically seen the Bible as not merely necessary, but as exclusively sufficient for all things, including whether to allow or disallow slavery. Diverse approaches to the Bible underscore the interrelationship of Christian division with the Christian slave trade. If you can't agree on what to do, and if you can't agree on why either, then argument will fester, and change, of whatever sort, will be deferred. So, what if you belong to a church that treats the Bible in a more restrictive sense? That is exactly what happened with 2 American Baptist ministers in the 19th century. The Southern pastor, Richard Fuller, and the Northern pastor, Francis Wayland. They disagreed strongly on slavery and co-published their correspondence in a book entitled Domestic Slavery Considered, as a scriptural institution. Wayland's opposition to slavery is best summed up with his simple phrase, principles over precepts. That is, it's the core values that matter most, because, in the Bible, core values give rise to specific commands, but specific commands are bound by time and place, whereas core values are not. And Wayland saw slavery as subversive of many key values, such as the New Testament's golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It is noteworthy that, in emphasizing principles over precepts, Wayland actually drew on Anglican theology, specifically the moral writings of Richard Whately, the Anglican Archbishop of Dublin, Ireland. According to Whately, it was no part of the scheme of the gospel revelation to lay down anything approaching to a complete system of moral precepts. Rather, he said, it's the job of each Christian to apply for himself, in each case, the principles of the gospel. So what? The hymn Amazing Grace is probably the best-known hymn in the English-speaking world. It's seen as a classic expression of Christian conversion. In the lyrics, the reality of human sin is met with and overcome by the grace of God. But it's long been suspected that the hymn has something of a political background. If so, Amazing Grace isn't just about sin as such. Rather, it's about a very specific sin, for Newton had been a slave trader. It was only after converting to Christianity that he became an abolitionist. If rooted in Newton's very specific life choices, the lyrics of Amazing Grace take on a narrower meaning, but one with greater emotional weight. For Newton, the experience of grace became a call to action, and he spent the last decades of his life working for abolition. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. I usually use this segment to detail recent academic literature, but, truth be told, today is mostly a product of my own reading in primary sources. First, there are multiple editions of Las Casas' short account. I've relied on the version published in the series Penguin Classics. It's edited and translated by Nigel Griffin, and it carries an insightful introduction by Anthony Pagden. The same is true of Equiano's Interesting Narrative, which is also published by Penguin Classics and edited by Vincent Corretta, the world's leading scholar on Equiano. If you want to read Newton's thoughts upon the African slave trade, the original 18th century pamphlet has been reproduced in its entirety in the series Cornell University Library Digital Collections. There's a modern critical edition of Fuller and Wayland's co-authored volume, Domestic Slavery, Considered as a Scriptural Institution. It's helpfully edited by Nathan Finn and Keith Harper. Finally, if you're interested in natural law, you should read Volume 2 of Quentin Skinner's impressive work, The Foundations of Modern Political Thought, Volume 2, The Age of Reformation. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.